I also was a massive Steve Martin fan as a kid. When I finished the film and I showed it to him, I got the best compliment I think I've ever gotten from a subject. He said, "Can I show it to my therapist?" Again, this very expensive form of therapy I'm providing here.
Hello and welcome to Obsessed the Podcast. I'm Matt Wilstein from The Daily Beast, and today on the show, I am talking to Morgan Neville, the Oscar winning filmmaker who has made documentaries about everyone from Johnny Cash and Iggy Pop to Anthony Bourdain and Steve Martin. Today, we are talking about his latest documentary, Man on the Run, about Paul McCartney. It is such a fascinating film that I could not wait to talk to him about. It deals with that period right after the Beatles broke up, and Paul was kind of on his own, didn't know what he was going to do, and dealt with a lot of stuff along the way. So we get into all of that on today's show. We also talked briefly at the top about Morgan's new documentary with Lorne Michaels, which is coming out in just a couple of months. So you know I am going to be all over that one. All right, this was a very fun conversation, so I want to get right into it. Here's me with Morgan Neville. Morgan Neville, welcome to Obsessed the Podcast. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks, Matt.
I feel like I'm catching you at a very big moment because not only do you have this Paul McCartney documentary about to premiere, but there's just been this new project announced, this Lorne Michaels documentary that's coming out much sooner than I expected. And people who listen to this show might know that SNL and Lorne is a personal obsession of mine. So I'm very excited for this one as well.
Well, you're the perfect audience for it. They just announced this morning, and you're the first person to ask me about it. So it is coming. I'm excited about that too.
I feel like usually documentaries are announced further in advance than this one. I was surprised it's coming out so soon.
Yeah, I think they yeah, it's moved around in terms of timing, and there are all kinds of forces for that. But I'm excited that it finally is going to find its audience. And if you're into comedy and SNL at all, this is definitely the film for you. I'm a fan, and I made it for people both who speak SNL and people who don't.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that one, and I want to get into Paul McCartney, Man on the Run, in just a minute. But first, I like to start these conversations by asking guests, what's the first piece of pop culture that you remember just being really obsessed with as a kid growing up?
I mean, here we are talking about a Paul McCartney film, and I don't think I'm exaggerating this by saying the Beatles, and it's because my dad was a massive Beatles fan. He saw the Beatles, but in my childhood home, my dad had an old jukebox that he had bought, and he filled it with Beatles 45s. So my earliest memories was we had this jukebox that would play 8 days a week or, whatever, and I loved it. So, I was pretty much into the Beatles as far back as I can remember.
Yeah, that was sort of going to be my next question was your introduction to the Beatles because, for me, I don't remember the first time I heard the Beatles. They've just always been a fabric of my life and sort of my awareness. Do you feel like you have that? Do you feel like you remember encountering the Beatles for the first time?
No, not at all. It was, they were just always there. And again, my dad was so into it that, I think we went and saw Yellow Submarine, this is before videotapes, and then I even remember my dad taking me because I was into it. We went to a Beatles fest when I was 11.
Mm.
Uh, and I remember that because they would screen things you couldn't see otherwise, you know, and they had guests and everything like that. But also, I was a big comedy fan. I loved the Ruddles
Oh, yeah.
too, and I thought that hilarious, a big Monty Python. And it was like those 2 worlds meeting in the Ruddles, you know. I got a brief clip of the Ruddles into this documentary. I had to. Um, so yeah, definitely an early and deep obsession.
So with that in mind, I mean, doing a documentary about Paul McCartney is a big deal. And so is there a story behind you making this project happen, getting the access to him and all of this material that you were able to get?
I mean, so the way it happened was I got a call from his manager, Scott, a longtime manager, saying, "Paul's interested in doing something about the Wings period. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Yes." But that was it in terms of what it would be. and I thought about it for 20 minutes, and I was like, "Well, the story has to begin with the end of the Beatles." And really, the film begins, essentially the day the Beatles break up, um, and ends the day John dies. It's that decade, really, and it's the decade that's also bookended by McCartney 1 and McCartney 2. But it's the decade where he has to figure out so much about his life. I mean, I just knew that was the arc of the story, and it's a question of you've been a Beatle your entire life since you're, 15 or 16. Suddenly it disappears, and you have to figure out all these other questions about your life because 'cause you've never known what it's like to be a solo artist, much less a person or a, newly married husband, new father. Like, all these things happen to Paul essentially in 1 year, through 1969 into 70. Um, so it just was a great starting point for the film. Um, but I think part of it too, why this happened, and I've talked to Paul about this, is that a lot about this period was very painful for him. I mean, a lot of the albums critics did not like. People were angry at him for breaking up the Beatles, even though he didn't. They were angry at all the Beatles for breaking up the Beatles. There was just kind of a heartbreak about the Beatles. Like, how can you do this to us Beatles fans? And that was critics, that was fans. There was just kind of an anger. And Paul ended up in massive legal battles with his former bandmates just to extricate himself from it. I mean, there was a lot that I think was just painful and kind of buried in Paul. And I think the experience of having made Get Back really let Paul think that maybe it wasn't as bad as everybody had said, and if you watch Get Back, Peter Jackson's kind of 8-hour version of the Let It Be sessions, you see friction, but you see love and humor, and you see brothers in a way, and you see that it it isn't terrible, it's just complicated, and I think that opened the door for Paul to say, "Well, why don't I now allow myself to go back and really think about this period of time," which he really hasn't.
Yeah, there is a lot of painful stuff there, and I think did you feel like it was still raw for him, this question of being blamed for breaking up the Beatles? Because it does seem like that he was dealing with that at the time of, people really, I think, unfairly putting it on him when I don't think he feels that it was his fault.
Yeah, I mean, there is some rawness, or even when I mean, he was mentioning some specific rock critics by name for reviews they wrote in 1971. So,
Yeah, he still remembers.
he still remembers. So it's not like, I don't think it's something he dwells on, but I think when poked or when I'm really kind of trying to lead him to talk about these things, and sometimes, reading him some of these reviews and kind of reminding him, um, it you see how raw, I guess some of it still is, but I think, you know, that I don't wanna say that making this film was only done for Paul's therapeutic purposes, but it certainly is a very effective and expensive form of therapy, so to make a film about this, because what I'm doing is asking Paul to really reevaluate this time and ask all these questions, and I think now even 50, 55 years later, which is incredible, I think it actually is helping him too, just him having now seen the film and we've talked about it, I think, yeah, I think it's still changing in his own mind.
Yeah, what did he tell you after seeing the film?
I mean, the first time we watched it, which is stressful to say the least, um, he watched it with Mary, his daughter, and they were reacting so volubly to the film because they're seeing their pets and they're seeing their Linda and they're seeing their house and all of this. So I think Paul was just kind of emotionally drained after watching it and just said, I think it's great." And then he organized a screening for his whole family. including all the grandkids, the cousins, and this was, in August. So it's been a moment, and he invited me to come, and it was incredible. The grandchildren were all sitting in front of me, and, one of them said, "I've never heard my grandmother's voice before," meaning Linda's voice, which I guess makes sense, like, when would they have? But, then I heard another one of the grandkids say, "Grandpa went to jail?" His Paul went to jail in Japan in 1980. Again, probably something they don't talk about on family vacations very often. Um, but I felt like, that there's a part of it that I think Paul feels like the film helps explain a lot, maybe to him and maybe to others about what he went through in that decade. Because coming down from the Beatles is kind of an impossible task for anybody, and it was for all 4 of them. But I think Paul actually did about as good of a job as he possibly could coming out of something like being a Beatle.
Yeah, part of the thing that's hanging over the movie and really comes to a head at the towards the end is this idea of the Beatles reuniting, which was, an obsession for people, as you're saying, um, and including the SNL moment that you include of Lorne Michaels offering them a paltry sum to come reunite on the air, which on SNL, which has been told before the story that it almost happened, which is just this fascinating sort of alternate universe to imagine. Um, why do you think that the Beatles didn't do that or didn't reunite or sort of decided to avoid that thing that so many bands are feel pressure to do? I think.
Well, I mean, I think in the early days, um, they were feuding, and I think they were all just trying to get away from each other in some ways. Um, then there was a moment when John was maybe gonna come play on Paul's, Venus and Mars. There was talk of John going to do that. So they, had considerably thawed by then. Um, but then it was right at the moment when John got back together with Yoko and kind of went into his, baking bread period of the late '70s and all of that. Um, and you see it in the documentary. Every single interview any of them gave in that entire decade, they were asked, "When are the Beatles gonna get back together?" They could not escape it. Um, and I actually think if John had lived, they would have gotten back together. That's just my personal take. Eventually, somehow, somewhere, maybe not completely, but I don't know, would have been Live Aid or something. Who knows what would have done it, but something I think would have brought them together at some point.
Yeah, I mean, the feeling that I got watching the movie and is that Paul probably took it for granted that that could happen someday because he wasn't imagining what was gonna happen to John, at the end of this decade that your film explores, and that's really it's so tragic that, you know, maybe they were feuding and they weren't, getting along, or they decided, we don't really wanna, take the time to do something together because they thought that they would be able to. Um, and that's yeah, it's devastating to think about the what if of John in general, but then also just what they could have done together.
Yeah, and I know John had told people that, you know, he was looking forward to playing things with Paul, and had definitely thought about it. Part of why John went back in the studio to do Double Fantasy was having heard Paul's McCartney 2 and coming up in that song and being spurred on by it. So yeah, but it's why I ended the film where I ended it and why I called the film Man on the Run, which is Paul is trying to escape the shadow of the Beatles throughout that whole decade, which is impossible. But he's trying, as they're all trying. And when John dies, there's no running anymore. And if you look at what happens, you know, Paul never records with Wings again. They break up. He starts recording as Paul McCartney for the rest of his entire career. The Paul we know now is kind of in tug of war. His next record is with George Martin and Ringo plays on it. And it's the kind of like running away from those things just stops. Suddenly he's like, okay, I can be a Beatle, and I can be a Wing, and I can be Paul, and I can embrace all of my history. I don't have to kind of cordon off part of it.
You think John's death, like, liberated him in some way to do that?
I do. I mean, in the most tragic way, but I just think the idea that, "Oh, the Beatles are gonna get together," you know, it just was an impossibility at that
Yeah, and
point.
once that's off the table, it really did change things.
And Paul also, kind of stopped touring. He didn't tour for a decade after John's death, and part of that is, just I don't know, maybe the violence of it or, but also Paul's kids suddenly were school age and, in the '80s he doesn't tour again until '89. So it just is a big shift. Everything kind of changes right there in 1980.
I was very interested in your decision to the fact that we hear his voice in this documentary, but we never see him as he is today, which was obviously a choice that you made, and I think you've done different documentaries in different ways. Was that how did you think about that choice? How deliberate was it? Was there a fundamental reason behind deciding to do things that way?
Well, there were a couple of things. I mean, the first thing was, is the archive rich enough to support that kind of storytelling? And it was. I mean, it helped that Paul was married to Linda, who was a photographer who took a million photos, and I'm not exaggerating, and, um, and everything else around it. Like, there was just a lot of material that I felt like it's possible to do that. Um, but then thinking about and I've done lots of documentaries where I interview people on camera and they talk about it, but there's something that happens when you take everybody off camera, and instead of it being a story about 80-year-olds looking back on 50 years ago retrospectively, it becomes a present tense story where you're kind of living through it in the moment, and I really liked that about it. It kept it a young person's story in that way, um, and just immersive. We talked about it and talked about it, but it just felt like it was working, and so we just kept going in that direction. Um, and now, yeah, I'm really happy with having decided to do that because it's not just looking at all the old Wings and Paul kind of talking about the good old days.
You've made so many music documentaries at this point, and I feel as a comedy fan that I have trouble watching a music documentary without thinking about Spinal Tap,
Mhm.
which has obviously, gotten renewed attention also for very tragic reasons in recent months. I'm curious how you relate to that film as someone who makes rock documentaries. Is it possible to not reference Spinal Tap? Is it possible? Like it feels like it changed how everyone watches these films. So does it change how you make them?
I mean, Spinal Tap's one of my all-time favorite films too. So, you know, again, an unusual documentary, but uh, but I love it because yeah, I mean, everything about it, the humor of it, but it's so funny because it's so close to the truth on so many of these things. Um, but in a way, my approach to music, storytelling, and I'm a musician, I love music, I'm a crazy music geek. But my mentor was the music writer Peter Guralnick, who wrote the big Elvis biography and, many other great books. And early on, he said, the 3 least interesting things about musicians are sex, drugs, and getting ripped off by your record label because everybody tells the same stories. And I think about that, and I feel like a lot of my films are kind of not about the things that all the traps that everybody gets into, but put that aside. What is unique about this person or this journey? And even this film, you know, I feel like put Paul's musical genius aside. Okay, we all know Paul's a genius. We all know he wrote great songs. That'll be there. But it's more, I thought about it as this is just a story of a guy who's 27, who's gone through this breakup and is trying to put his life together in a way that is actually oddly relatable. Um, so yeah, so I try and avoid those traps as much as I can in my storytelling.
I want to talk about more of your films, and we don't have that much time, but I thought we could kind of run through a kind of a speed round of some of your other projects. and just see if there's a memory or something, sort of the first thing that comes to mind when you think about them. Going all the way back to, I think one of your earliest ones was Brian Wilson, in 1999. When you think about making that film, what comes to mind?
I remember sitting at his house one day, and we're in the basement, and everybody left, and it was just the 2 of us, and Brian was always a little awkward, uh, and he said, "Hey, do you exercise?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah, I exercise," and then we talked about exercising for, like, half an hour. We weren't filming or anything, we were just hanging out. It was like, "This is so surreal," and I was such a Brian fan, um, but like a lot of famous people like that, um, they're happiest not talking about Pet Sounds or Sergeant Pepper or whatever. They're just happiest talking about normal things because that's what they don't get to do that often.
What about Johnny Cash?
I never met Johnny. I did this film, Johnny Cash's America, um, as a way to kind of understand America too. I mean, one of the big themes of my films has been how does culture connect us or divide us? And Johnny Cash is one of those unicorn characters in America who people read themselves into. The man in black, but he's like a tabula rasa where evangelicals and punk rockers claim Johnny as their own. And he was both, and that at a time when we don't have many things in the Venn diagram of our culture that connect both sides, Johnny is kind of a bullseye for that. And so why is that? And it was really a film in many ways about America too, and it's those questions are more relevant than ever now.
Then there was Iggy Pop, who feels like an incredible documentary subject on so many levels. What are your strongest memories of him?
Iggy, I love Iggy, um, and just one of the smartest, you know, most interesting people I've ever interviewed. My favorite memory of that was he was rehearsing with the Stooges because they were gonna do a reunion show, and they had a rehearsal space in Hollywood, and I stood in the middle of the room while they rehearsed around me, and it was just as a music fan, like, doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah. Um, in 2013, I believe, or 2014, you made 20 Feet from Stardom, which is a favorite of mine. That's the one that won you the Academy Award for Best Documentary. For anyone who hasn't seen it, it's incredible. It's about backup singers. Um, I still think a lot about the first time I heard the isolated "Gimme Shelter" track, which is just the mind blowing moment of that film. When did you hear that for the first time, and what was your reaction to it?
I actually heard it on YouTube because somebody had leaked a stem of it somehow because and maybe it was because they had used the track in Guitar Hero or some video game, and so the stems had gotten out, and somebody had isolated it, and it didn't even last very long, but I heard it, immediately ripped it because I was like, "I need to save this." And when I interviewed Mary, I played it for her, and she told that story. I didn't know what the story was. I just thought, "This is incredible," and she tells this incredible story of being roused from bed by Jack Nietzsche, who is the helping produce the album, and going down and meeting the Stones, and 2 AM in her with curlers in her hair and doing that track, which is incredible, and I just remember after she told me that story, just thinking, "Oh my god, that's just one of the all-time great music stories I've ever heard," and then thinking, "Oh my god, I have to clear a Rolling Stones song for this. How's that gonna happen?"
Yeah, the movie. Yeah, you needed it.
And then I interviewed Mick, and he told his version of the same story. It was almost like, this story's too crazy to be true, and then he told that story, and that story had never been told. It was just one of those great things that happened on that film. You know, that film had so many great serendipitous moments, and that was one of them.
I was also a massive Anthony Bourdain fan, so I loved your film Roadrunner about him. Um, how do you think about that experience now? I think the part of it got overshadowed a little bit by a controversy around his using his voice, using AI to sort of recreate his voice. So I'm curious what you how you think about that now, because I think AI has only become a much bigger topic in our culture. But how do you think about that now?
I love Bourdain, and I think of him kind of as like a documentary filmmaker too, in terms of who he was and what he was doing. Um, and yeah, in the film, I did use AI for a few sentences of his VO, um, which people didn't, it got very blown out of proportion. But at the time, I thought it was Bourdain was such a punk, kind of like break every rule, you know, and I talked to all of his friends about it. It wasn't like a secret from his friends, the producers or anybody. And nobody kind of blinked about it. It just felt like like an Easter egg or something. Uh, and then, but it obviously became a landmine. People, and now, I mean, AI has only become scarier and scarier ever since. So, it was done trying to kind of creatively honor his irreverence in a way, but it, yeah, became part of a much bigger debate, and we're only at the beginning of that debate
Yeah.
still.
Would it make you hesitate to use AI in the future as a filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, and I haven't used it since, but I will say AI is like a big, sloppy label for all kinds of things, and if you're 20 years ago, if you were mixing something and we're trying to bring out some frequencies, you were using some version of AI, so again, it's like we're talking about like generative AI or sentient AI versus, a tool, a plugin that might help you mix a track.
It's a nuanced conversation.
So I feel like nuance is kind of lost when you get into these discussions. So I'll leave it to others.
What about Steve Martin? Obviously, another favorite of mine, and I love that film as well. Did you get to know him much through that process, and what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I also was a massive Steve Martin fan as a kid. Um, my dad took me to see Steve Martin do stand up just before he quit stand up in 1980. And again, I was like 12. I had a very cool dad. He did these things with me. Um, and but Steve also is not the easiest subject. He's kind of famously private and reserved. And again, I feel like um, my job is to kind of listen to them as much as I can and try and help them understand what I need. I mean, the thing that actually um, that I really respected about Steve, Steve has written a number of novels, in addition to movies and everything else, and I just when I talked to him as a storyteller and said, "I'm telling this story about you, and I need to kind of go to these places," and I think I know he got it. And so, you know, when I finished the film and I showed it to him, I got the best compliment I think I've ever gotten from a subject. He said, "Can I show it to my therapist?" I thought, "Okay," you know, again, like it's this very expensive form of therapy I'm providing
Yeah,
here.
that's what we're learning today. Is that yeah, you're basically doing therapy for these very talented people. Yeah, I feel like there's that phrase "never meet your heroes," and now you've met a lot of them. Do you feel like do you feel like that's a an accurate idea, or do you feel like you've had experiences that confirm that, or that defy that?
I mean, I've had experiences of films I've flirted with doing that I haven't done because
For those reasons.
because for me to sign on to doing a film, I have to know that they're willing to go at least somewhere down that road, and it's not like I'm expecting them to, I mean, Steve literally gave me his diaries and things like that. It was very, after months and months and months of working together and trust building and all that. Um, but but if somebody's there just to do a legacy piece and burnish their reputation or have people just say nice things about them, that's not that's not a movie to me. So Um, yeah, so to me, the decision happens early on of like, okay, are they gonna show up?
Yeah. So I guess you're saying you wouldn't have made the Melania Trump documentary?
Yeah, is that a documentary?
That's a good question. It's been described that way, but it doesn't really seem like it.
Might be branded content, I'm not sure.
Do you have a dream subject, someone who you've been chasing that you haven't gotten to do yet?
I mean, I've been hitting a lot of white
Yeah, you
whales.
have.
Yeah, I mean, the one subject I've wanted to do for a long time, and maybe I will someday, is Shel Silverstein, the writer and songwriter, and
Yeah, he was huge for me as a kid.
me too. I love the tone of his writing, and, um, yeah, that's one I'm still chasing.
Is there anything that you said no to or turned down that you now kind of wish you had said yes to in your career?
No. I mean, there are some films that I turned down that became very successful, but they're not my film, it's not like a script where the architecture of the film is there. When you're making a documentary, it's kind of a blank page. Like, there may be a subject and there may be some archive or some whatever, but whatever film I would have made, I'm sure is drastically different from whatever film another filmmaker made. And that's great, so I don't feel like somebody made my film, and, um, but but when you make a film, you're giving up a big piece of your life for it. So you really, particularly the older I get, feel like these decisions are very important decisions. Your time is your most valuable thing, and if I'm gonna invest 2 years of my life in something, I have to really believe in it.
Have you ever felt the other way, like you said yes to something and then regretted committing to it?
Maybe earlier in my career, I'm never horribly, but sometimes, like, this didn't quite go like I thought it was gonna go, um, but I've been doing this for over 30 years. It's a long road.
When you look back on those 30 years, is there a story that makes you laugh now, but really just was not funny when it happened?
Oh, I mean, there were definitely some really tough shoots that become very funny in retrospect, but are definitely not funny. I mean, just being on location and having, you know, so many things go wrong, weather, people. I remember, I created a show with David Chang called Ugly Delicious, a food show and that was super fun. But I remember shooting in Naples and the crew mutinied on us because we weren't paying them in cash, and took her hostage, like that kind of stuff that was not fun at the time, but became part of the lore. Uh, but I feel like at this point, I've been doing it long enough that even if something bad happens, I can almost step out of it already and be like, I know we're going to get past this somehow.
That's a good attitude to have.
Yeah, let's get to the laughing about it part.
We talked about how the Beatles were your first pop culture obsession. What's something that you're really digging right now that you're into that you have seen or watched or something that you would just recommend to people that you love?
God, I mean, we're at the end of the year going to the new year. So I've just, because I'm part of the doc documentary branch of the Motion Picture Academy. So, I just binged like 60 documentaries.
Was there one that stood out to you or something that like really hit you?
So many great documentaries this year. And the thing about documentaries is even a not great documentary, you're going to learn something from. You can't say that about scripted films. Um, but there's some great documentaries and like some funky, weird ones that didn't get nominated or shortlisted, but some great ones. Come See Me in a Good Light. I loved that's
So
nominated.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, so I always encourage people to watch docs. I feel like when I started, documentaries were the spinach of filmmaking. It was like good for you, but didn't necessarily taste good. Um, and I've seen such a transformation with documentary since then. But I I still feel like, um, you know, our jobs as documentary filmmakers is to be entrusted with the truth of something. People trust us, our subjects trust us, the people we interview, the people we take their time, and then they let us share those stories with people. There's a huge responsibility in that. Um, and so, to me, it's the best job there is. It's the only job I've ever really wanted to do. So, I just encourage people to keep watching docs and not just the kind of splashy docs or even the Paul McCartney docs. Also look for the little docs. There's so many good ones out there.
Well, Morgan, I think your work has gone a long way towards changing the way people think about documentaries, and I've loved so many of the projects that you've made, including this new one. And I'm very much looking forward to the Lorne documentary as well. So I might be calling you up to come back to talk about that one in a couple months. Um, but for now, Man on the Run is playing in theaters for one night only on Thursday, February 19th, and then will be available to stream on Amazon Prime Video starting Friday, February 27th. Morgan Neville, thank you so much for being here.
Great talking to you.
All right. Thank you again to Morgan Neville for that great conversation. I am a huge fan of so many of his movies, so I'm so glad we got to talk about all of them on this episode. And yes, I will be reaching out to him again when that Lorne Michaels documentary comes out, so we can hopefully have him back on the show. Don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube at The Obsessed channel. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at Beast Obsessed, where we are putting out so much great content. And let us know what you like about the show by leaving us a comment. We want to hear from you, so thank you so much for reaching out. Thank you to our producers, Devin Rogerino and Rachel Passer, and we'll be back with an all-new episode very soon. Bye.